Welcome to Saturday Morning Classics. We are currently in the middle of The Island by T.M. Wright. And we're getting pretty close to the ending here. I think it's just going to be a couple more weeks. So anyway, grab a cup of coffee, sit down and relax, and enjoy the story. Night. Change occurs quickly in the Adirondacks. Temperatures rise and fall as if on a whim. The darkness happens all at once, with only a nod to twilight. Autumn ends like the closing of a door. It is a place of contrasts, a place where the colors of the land do not bleed together, but are as sharply delineated, as exquisite and mundane as the words of a lover. It is a place that does not embrace, but holds and keeps. A place that does not need its people, but tolerates them and gives them life, pain, acceleration. Early in the evening on January 23rd, a snowfall came to Seventh Lake. It came all at once, carried in on a strong wind. It did not settle immediately. It scattered and drifted, sought out corners and hidden areas, and rested there, then was pushed on again by the wind. A low front plunging out of Canada brought the snowfall and the wind, and it brought a numbing Arctic cold with it too, the kind that stops the breath and makes the earth crunch underfoot. Quickly enough, the snow and the wind stopped. Then the cold settled into many pines like the news of a death. Francis Carden was standing inside the gazebo at the tip of the peninsula. He was dressed as if for summer, in a green short-sleeved shirt and jeans. He was thinking that he had never been so god-awful cold, but that it was all right because cold was forever. Cold was eternal. Cold was the way of things in the universe, if it was really true that the stars and the planets accounted for only a very, very small part of it. And of course it was true. Any fool could see that it was true. And he was thinking also that he wanted desperately to get warm, that all he had to do to get warm was to go back to the inn, and that was simple enough. And he was thinking that there was something very wrong with him for doing what he was doing, for standing inside the gazebo at night in short sleeves in January, alone, dressed as if for summer. He was shivering. He knew what shivering was for. It was to keep the blood warm with movement, and he decided that the body possessed comically ineffective defenses against cold. It put hair on the head because most body heat was lost there, and then, with age, made that hair disappear. It put itself to sleep in the cold, and so made itself comfortable, and death easy. But it was clear enough why these defenses were so ineffective, so much as if they were an afterthought. It was because the body was mortal and cold was eternal. Cold was the way of things. Life and warmth were like tiny artificial bits of color on the still, flat, dead face of the universe. He was seeing lights on the dark opposite shore of the lake. They were the lights of year-round cottages, and there were only a few of them. One of the lights winked intermittently, as if someone were walking back and forth in front of it. He realized at once that there was something wonderful and comforting about standing in the gazebo in the cold. He was giving himself up to the universe, to eternity, giving up his long fight with it, giving up his stupid and futile humanness. Because cold was forever. Then, all of a sudden, He realized that there was something standing with him in the still, cold dark in the gazebo, and he screamed. Pete Meyer Jr. heard him, rose from his bed, and went to his window. He saw the roof of the gazebo, a cream-colored splotch in the darkness. He said, eyes on it, "Mama, there's a man down there screaming," though he saw no one. He turned his head. Lynette had been in the room with him, resting. "Mama?" He padded over to her bed, leaned down on it, felt it. The bed was empty. He went to the door, opened it, stepped into the hallway. "Mama?" he called, but got no reply. He had his hand on the doorknob. He hesitated, uncertain. He shivered, stepped back into the room, returned to the window. He thought about Harry Stans, about Harry and his mother in bed together, and he hoped that it was Harry who was screaming outside, that the devil itself was gouging out Harry's eyes or pulling his arms off. And from below, Frances Carden's screams continued. Chapter 6. The screams continued, and the thing standing beside him, its soft blue eyes turned his way, its skin as translucent as paper, its mouth lipless and flat, withdrew. And Frances Carden ran from the gazebo. Pete Jr. said to himself, "That man is damn stupid." January 24th, morning. Arnaud had laid out an alternate route for cross-country skiing. It led through flat country north of the inn, then circled back onto some high hills, and finally turned west to an area not far from the little group of cottages where Lynette Meyer made her home. From there, he planned to follow the lake shore back to the inn. Today there were 6 inches of powdery snow on a base of 4 inches of packed snow, and the morning sky was overcast, the air frigid. Arnaud said to Jean Ward, standing with him in her skis near the southern edge of the line of cabins, "You're going to perspirate to kingdom come in that, as I said," and nodded to indicate the several layers of sweaters she was wearing. She had borrowed them from Arnaud. She gave him an embarrassed grin. "I got up feeling cold this morning, Arnaud. I'm still cold." Arnaud smiled back. "Take my words in it, Jean. The manner of skiing this will enlarge your sweat." She nodded. "I'll chance it." She glanced back toward the main inn. "How many others are coming along on this excursion, Arnaud?" "The Glynns," he answered, "and Muriel Fox, and Frances." "That's it?" Arnaud shrugged. "There is Mary. She's not a skier." "Mary can't ski?" Arnaud shook his head. "No ambition in it, and that is fomented by a hatred of snow and of dire cold, as she would pronounce this morning. I had no idea. I thought that, being your daughter and all." "And so is like her mother, also not a skier, and not a swimmer either. Mary swims, though. I impositioned it on her." A hawk soared over, heading north, toward Dog Island. Jean watched it. "Wonderful creature," she said. "Yes," said Arnaud, "my agreement. It goes there." He pointed at Dog Island. Its outline was obscured against the backdrop of the north shore of the lake, so it was little more than a dark gray lump sticking out of the water. He continued, "It makes its nest," and then was interrupted by Jeff Glenn, who called to them from just outside the inn's south entrance. "Good morning. We're ready?" and began skiing over a distance of 150 feet. Arnaud called back, "All ready, Mr. Glenn. And your wife?" Jeff shook his head. Not comin'. Watchin' the baby. He pushed himself expertly forward on his skis, and a few moments later was standing alongside Jean. "Good morning, Miss Ward. How are you feeling?" "Good morning," she said, and smiled. "Call me Jean." "Okay, and I'm Jeff." Arnaud said, "Your wife's not coming?" "No, she says she's not in the mood for skiing. She's watching Samantha. I guess she decided it wouldn't be smart to bring her along, after all." Jeff was dressed in his loose-fitting dark blue ski jacket, matching dark blue ski mittens, and brown corduroy pants. He wore no hat, and his mid-length blonde hair shot off in many directions, as if he had washed it the night before and then had slept on it. He patted the pocket of his jacket and scowled. "Would one of you have a cigarette?" "Sorry," Jean told him. "No such habit for me," said Arnaud, and added, "Wasn't it your wife's thought to linger here at the inn in order that she might ski?" "Yes," he said. "She's changed her mind. It wouldn't be the first time. She says she's very comfortable just where she is." Muriel Fox and Frances Carden came out of the inn. They were both carrying their skis. Muriel waved, and Jean, Arnaud, and Jeff waved back simultaneously, ski poles dangling from their wrists and wagging in the gray early morning light. Muriel and Frances stopped to put their skis on before coming over. Jeff again asked if either Jean or Arnaud had a cigarette, again was told that neither of them smoked, and by this time Frances and Muriel had come over to join the group and begin the morning. From a second-floor window of the inn, the entity saw nothing recognizable. It saw snow and people and cabins beyond, trees and color and ski poles wagging, and it saw the lake shore, the tennis courts, cars passing now and then on Route 43. But all of these things were props from a past that was far beyond it, far behind it, a past that was part and substance of another world, and the entity saw them the way a lizard might watch a TV game show, with its eyes on the movement and its attention fixed forever on itself. Only this had survived intact from the world of its past to the world of anarchy it now inhabited. The entity said, with its pale blue eyes on the movement below, "Tell them, tell them, tell them." And as it said these words, other words came from it, as if the entity had a dozen sets of vocal cords, although, in fact, it had none. These words were, "A stitch in time saves 9, and don't count your chickens," and "I love you, Charlene," and "propane," and "I'm not stupid." Anyone listening would have guessed that there was a crowd in the room, although it was empty, except for the entity, which was the length of galaxies, the breadth of air, the weight of dust. "Tell them," it whispered. Jean Ward said to Arnaud, "I wonder if he would like to come with us." She nodded toward the window at which the entity stood. She went on, smiling as if in apology. "No, perhaps not." Arnaud said, "Who?" "Sorry," Jean said. "I know, I saw the man. It was translucent. I want to know who the man in the window is." "Well, isn't he another guest?" Jean asked. "What is his name?" said Arnaud. "I don't know what his name is." "I know his name," said Jeff Glynn. "He told me." He cocked his head. "I'm sure he told me." "I've spoken with him at length," said Muriel Fox. "He's very comforting. He talks about inconsequentials. He doesn't like the cold." A look of contentment gathered on her small, square face. Her heavy-lidded, dark eyes crinkled up a little, as if she were remembering something that gave her pleasure. "I believe that his name is—" She paused. "Well, I guess he never told me his name," she went on, and her look of contentment became a look of confusion. We talked for a very long time, and he never told me his name, nor did he ask mine." "He was in the cabin next to mine," Jean said. "We talked quite a lot. He came over and we talked. He was always very cold. He always complained of the cold." She nodded at the window. "See there? He's gone now." The entity stood by the closed door and waited. It had experienced a lifetime of waiting. It had waited for love, and it had waited for money, and it had waited for death. Now it waited in the cold room for the door to be opened. And once the door was opened, the entity would go to the next door, and it would wait there. It accepted as unquestionable fact that unopened doors were barriers. It went through only when doors were opened. It went through only when it was invited through. It existed in a world of confusion, where switches opened and closed at random, where tears fell into mouths caught in the climax of a laugh, where need was left over from the world that had gone before. But these were mixed with lust and with memory, longing, pain, and pain was mixed with pleasure, and pleasure with guilt, hatred, love, and love with confusion. And in the house, under the lake, a figure in big bird pajamas stood at the bottom of the stairway. The figure's small mouth was opened very wide, as if to scream. The figure remembered screams. It remembered the screams that the sting of hornets caused, and it remembered the screams that nightmares caused. It screamed now, but no sound came from it. The water in the house would not conduct it, nor would the walls. Sound was stilled somewhere above the roof. "Maybe he's like a stowaway," said Jeff Glenn. "Maybe he's a hotel stowaway." Jeff smiled at the little group listening to him. "I like that," he said. "I think that's pretty creative. He finds himself a room in a hotel that, for all intents and purposes, is empty, and he stays there, a hotel stowaway." Francis Carden grumbled, "Let's get this show on the road." He looked at Arnaud. "What do you say, Arnaud? Can we get this show on the road?" "Yes," Arnaud answered. He pointed toward the parking lot. "Today we'll go there first," he said, as a way of describing the route he'd laid out for them. "Across the parking lot?" asked Muriel Fox. "Alongside it," Arnaud said. "It's a 5-mile distance." He pointed south and swung his arm east as he talked. "1.5 miles there, 1 mile there, by the lodges owned by Mr. Oakland, from whom I have permission on which to trespass. Then there," he was pointing east, "up to the high hill you see tipping the air, and so back around to the cabins here." He was pointing at them, alongside the lake shore, to our point of emergence. "Sounds like more than 5 miles to me," said Francis Carden. Muriel said, "It's a good warm-up." "Warm-up?" said Carden, and smiled. "You haven't been cross-country skiing before, have you, Mr. Carden?" He shrugged. "I've been skiing." She shook her head. "It's not the same," and Arnaud jumped in, sensing animosity between them. "So, in respect of the morning's decay, the departure of us all should speedily en masse." "I agree," Jean said. "With what?" Francis Carden asked. And Arnaud said, using a phrase he used often, one that he thought was a lifesaver, "You know what I mean." Lynette Meyer felt as if she were going to burst, as if she had eaten heavily and was bloated and could do nothing but sit and rest. There were things inside her, and they were eating her up. That is what she thought, and how she saw herself. It was not the first time she had felt that way. She had felt that way 100 times before. Her eyes were on her own eyes, reflected from the mirror, and her mind was on the idea that she was fat and that there were things inside her that were eating her up. She was thinking that she missed Pete and that Harry Stans could not possibly take his place, no matter how hard he tried, and Lord knew that he had tried very hard. But still there was something eating her up from the inside. Something had gotten into her belly and was devouring her. She could feel it. And because it was inside her, it was making her feel bloated, as if she were going to burst. "Mama," said Pete Jr. from the bed, "it's awful cold in here." She looked at him and nodded. She said, "Yes, it certainly is," then looked again in the mirror at her own eyes and liked them, and felt the cold that Pete Jr. felt, and felt the things inside her that were eating her up, the things in her gut and in her heart that were eating her up. They all had to do with Pete, of course, and nothing to do with Harry Stans. "Mama," Pete Jr. said again, "it's awful damn cold in this room, and I think we ought to go home." This time she added a smile to her nod, and she said, "We gonna go home sooner or later, Pete." "I ain't feeling so damn good, Mama. I feel awful funny. I feel funny inside." She nodded. She knew what he meant. She could feel her insides wanting to cut out, wanting to spray the walls. It was very uncomfortable here, but the cold was comfortable. It felt right. It felt the way her memory of Pete's kisses felt, and that was good. Pete's kisses had been good once, had been wet and slurpy, the way kisses were meant to be. The cold felt like her memory of those kisses, and it warmed her everywhere but where her nerves touched the surface of her skin. She said, "I feel good here, Pete." "Well, I feel like shit," said Pete Jr. She continued looking at her eyes reflected in the mirror. She thought they were good eyes, her own eyes, someone else's eyes. Pete's. They were Pete's eyes, and that was all right. They had the coolness of his eyes, puffy lids and stumpy eyelashes. He had invaded her. She was sure of it. He had come down the hillside and followed the lake shore past the cabins, and he had come into her body. It was him there, him making her feel bloated and filled up, and him eating her guts. Pete Jr. said, "I'm scared, Mama. This ain't no place for us, and I don't feel good." But Lynette felt good. She kept the axe in the closet of her room. She went out to the closet now, opened the door, took the axe out. Pete sat up in bed, wide-eyed. "Where you going with that, Mama?" "There's ice on the lake, son," she said. "I'm gonna go and chop it." Chapter 7. "It's like ice skating," Arnaud called. "It's like ice skating. Pretend you're ice skating." He glanced back, arms swinging in a close, wide arc near his body, legs pushing powerfully. He had once considered that cross-country skiing on flat terrain was an awkward-looking pastime, unnatural to the normal rhythms of the body, like running a three-legged race. Now he thought it was similar to the movements in a dream, fluid, graceful, capable of much more in distance than could be accounted for by the energy expended. Francis Carden called from the rear of the little group. "We've all done this before, Arnaud. We don't need your instruction." "Pretend you are ice skating," Arnaud repeated. "It's like ice skating." He noticed a tinge of anger in his voice, and he had no idea where that came from. Jean Ward was a couple of feet behind and to his right. Muriel Fox was giggling as if at some private joke. She was right behind Jean. Jeff Glenn and Francis Carden were 10 yards back and had been talking together since leaving the inn 20 minutes before. The group was at the center of a wide, flat field. The snow here was shallower than near the inn because the wind the previous evening, unfettered by buildings and trees, had pushed it into narrow, sharp-edged drifts, and occasionally Arnaud had had to detour past spots where the brown earth showed through. He wondered if the wooded area they were approaching would also be bare of snow in spots, and he thought he should have paced the route out first before bringing the others. But now they were all here, they were moving, and that was all that was important. Bare spots could be detoured around, the route restructured to the demands of the lay of the land. Now they were moving. He was moving, putting time behind him, working himself into exhaustion, centering his mind and his energies on the movements of his arms and his legs, on keeping them fluid and graceful and efficient. Not thinking about Martha, or about the inn, about the cold, or the memories, about the tragedies that had visited themselves upon Seventh Lake again and again over the years, as if the lake were the focus of bad news. Here, nothing haunted him. "It's like ice skating," he called. "Pretend you are ice skating." "We've heard that," said Jean Ward. Muriel Fox giggled again. Arnaud looked back at Muriel. She had her eyes straight ahead. She was moving with much skill and grace and efficiency. He nodded at her and turned his head back. He decided that he was covering the distance across the field to the stand of woods a half-mile off very quickly. As quickly as if in a dream, that was certain. As quickly as sound. The stand of trees was sweeping toward him as if he had taken flight. What had only seconds before been a muddle of brown and green, like woods modeled from a lump of clay, was rapidly taking definition. There a knot was visible, and there a black squirrel chased another black squirrel up the trunk of an oak, and over there a clump of leaves, still green, clung to the lower branches of a young maple tree, and there were people. What? But no. This is taking forever, called Francis Carden. Muriel Fox giggled again. "This is quick," said Arnaud, "like ice skating." "Arnaud?" said Jean Ward. He did not hear the concern in her voice. "No people. Only the spaces between trees, the undulations of branches, the change in perspective as his body moved right and left, the overcast sky, the sweat flowing into his eyes from exertion, the memories, the tragedy, as if Seventh Lake were the focus of bad news. "You're going awfully slow," said Jean. "I am as quick as sound," said Arnaud. "You're barely moving," said Jean. Like movement in a dream, molasses movement in a dream, feet stuck, mind numb, memories pushing hard. "We're going to get there sometime tomorrow, for God's sakes," yelled Francis Carden. Muriel Fox giggled. Jean said, "Arnaud, are you all right?" He did not answer. Jean said, "Let's stop. I think we need to stop. Arnaud?" He said nothing. They sat him down in the snow. The woods, a half-mile off, swept toward him and passed, and he was on the hillside, then down at the lake shore, struggling over mounds of ice, pushed up by a storm, jabbing his ski poles in hard to keep his balance. "Arnaud, can you answer me, please? Can you see my fingers?" They stood him up. "We should take his skis off," said Jeff Glenn. "I think it would be easier if we took his skis off, don't you?" "We could slide him," Jean Ward suggested. "We could slide him along on his skis back to the inn. It would be easier than trying to walk him." "That's a good idea," said Jeff Glenn. Jean said, "Arnaud? Arnaud, please, you're making me feel very concerned." Jeff said, "It's like an epileptic seizure, I think." Pushing himself along over the ice on the lake to the spot where Martha had gone in, and hammering the ice with his hands, breaking it and crawling in through the hole, and going down into that immense cold, finding her, holding her, and laughing, kissing her and laughing. "I think we better get him back to the inn," Jean said. "It's damn cold out here," said Francis Carden. "I like the cold," said Muriel Fox. "I am fine," said Arnaud. "Arnaud?" "Fine," he said. "Oh, thank God, you had us so worried." "We'll continue now. It's like ice skating, remember? Like ice skating." He pushed himself to his feet. Jean took his arm, shook her head. "No, Arnaud, we're going back to the inn." He thought a moment, reflected, considered. "Yes," he said, "the inn." At the house under the lake, nails holding the staircase intact had begun to rust, but the wood was waterlogged and swollen, so the staircase, like the house, held itself together. And though the thing that moved with aching slowness down the staircase through the frigid, dark water possessed the weight of need and desperation, the weight of memory, and the crushing pressure of eternity, that pressure was on everything in the house, on every fiber and cell, so it was equal here to there, from floor to ceiling, staircase to archway to hall, and the staircase held the weight of it, and the thing moved down the staircase and stood silently with its mouth wide, as if to scream, because the scream of its own dying was still in it, just as the groan and pleasure of living had been in it. It stood naked and apparently female, in the cold, dark water at the bottom of the staircase. It opened its mouth impossibly wide, as if to accept some huge mouthful of food. Its eyes, which were green and sightless, shed tears, and the tears floated off like droplets of oil. On some mornings, Arnaud said to his daughter Mary, in summer, in late summer, in the early morning, in the heat, he smiled up at her from the love seat in his office. She was seated on the arm of the love seat. She smiled back. "Yes?" she said, and he was instantly uncomfortable with her tone. It was too adult, too mature, too much the tone of a woman offering her understanding and goodwill. He went on, "In the early morning, if it is warm, and there's nothing quite so enchanting as early morning warmth here at the inn, I have seen a mist rising from this lake." He nodded at Seventh Lake, visible out the big window in his office, though he couldn't see it from where he was sitting. "And I see her in the mist, in the movements of the mist." He smiled to himself. "Of course. How could I not see her, Mary? I see her everywhere." Mary put her hand on his shoulder. He put his hand on her hand and said, "I have trouble." "Yes?" she said. It was a question. "Yes, she is here." Mary took her hand away. "I'm sorry for what happened today, Dad. I wish I'd been there. I think I would have known what to do." He smiled at her again, a smile of thanks. They knew what to do. Jean did, and the others. "What do you think caused it, Dad? Was it something like epilepsy?" He noticed that her tone had changed. It was a tone he liked now, the tone of a daughter worried about the father she loved. He shook his head. "I wish I knew. I don't." Mary leaned over, kissed him on the forehead. She straightened, smiled. "I'm glad you still love her, Dad." "I don't, though." He shook his head, repeated, "I don't." added, "How can I love a dead woman?" Mary's smile faded. She cleared her throat nervously and stared at him for a moment in what he knew was miserable incomprehension. He said, "It was a mistake opening the inn this winter." Mary would not be gotten off the subject. "I love her too, Dad. You know I love her. You love what you see in your memory. You love a ghost." She took her hand from his shoulder and went to the window that looked out on Seventh Lake. She said, "Ghosts are all we can love, Dad. You told me that, and you were right." "Then we can love nothing," he said. "Life is all we have, and if you love a ghost, then you love nothing." Chapter 8. January 25th. "There's nothing keeping us here," Jeff Glenn said, "and you know it's going to end up costing us an arm and a leg." From the bed, as she nursed Samantha, Amy answered, "I don't think we should leave just now. I think it would be bad for Samantha to travel, don't you?" She gave him a quizzical smile, and Jeff thought how very comfortable she looked, how motherly and how soft. She even looked plumper, somehow, though she was far from overweight. She looked, he decided, like a child's picture book representation of a mother with child. Dark, soft hair fluffed around her head, red, rosy cheeks denoting the glow of health, and plump, inane smile. "I don't believe," Jeff began, "that it's in Samantha's best interests to stay. And besides, I'm not sure that I like it here." "I love it here," Amy said without hesitation. "It's comfortable. It's like being home." "How could that be?" Jeff looked at her again, mystified. Home for both of them was a tract house in a Syracuse suburb, just the kind of place that she'd been raised in. "It is," she declared, still smiling. "It simply is, Jeff." She studied Samantha a moment, then pulled her gently away from her breast. "Home is where the heart is, Jeff." He grinned. "I think you're losing it, babe." "I've lost nothing," she said softly, still smiling. "I've found something. I've found peace. I've found it here. And so I'm going to stay. You can go if you want." Jeff grinned nervously. "You're joking." "Who's joking? I don't need you to stay with me. Besides, don't you have work to do at home? Why don't you go, Jeff? It'll be easier for us all." "I don't believe what I'm hearing." She ignored the remark. She said, "I took her to the lake yesterday while you were skiing." "Sorry? Took who?" "Took who? Who do you think? I took Samantha. I took her to the lake and I stood at the shore with her. She loved it. She was very comfortable with it, as I was." Jeff's nervous smile wavered, came back. "I don't understand that," he said. "Comfortable with what?" "You see," she said, "that's why I say you should go back to Syracuse. You don't belong here. I do. So does Samantha." She tweaked Samantha's little nose with her finger. "Don't you, darling? Don't you love it here?" The child made a quick, cooing noise, like the sound of a pigeon. "You see, Jeff? She agrees. She's comfortable here, too, and she wants to stay. But you don't. You aren't comfortable, and you don't want to stay. I can understand that. This is not your element. You're more artificial. No, I don't mean that. Yes, I do. I do mean it." She paused, adjusted Samantha's hold on her nipple, stroked the child's cheek. She continued, "I know what it is we have here, Jeff. What Samantha and I have here. We have eternity." These stolen moments of warmth were delicious and brief, like the tang of apples taken from a private orchard. They were moments when time came back, and with it pain and longing and desperation. So the warmth was returned, and the cold allowed to clamp down hard, which was the way of things in the universe. The entity understood the reasons for none of this. It passed from here to there like dust. It paused, it possessed for warmth, it moved on. And the entity did it all as blindly as a photograph which captures color but does not see it. Mary was remembering a letter that her father had written to her several years earlier, but had sent only recently. The letter had read, in part, "The reason we do not like to be alone is simple. We do not like to be alone because when we are alone and there are no distractions, then we must look inward, and when we do, we experience there, inside of us, a sea of stars, cold infinity. And that is when we seek out the artificial around us, when we must go to a movie by ourselves or call a friend or dig out the cards and play solitaire." She remembered thinking that it had been merely the meanderings of a mind still obsessed with the loss of love, because his wife, Mary's mother, had died only a month earlier. But he had added, "So I wonder how the dead react to that, to looking constantly inward and experiencing only what there is to experience there. It is what I see for Martha. It is, doubtless, what hell is about." He had touched a bit of that hell himself the day before, Mary thought. She had felt it in him later, had glimpsed it with him. Infinity, eternity, power and powerlessness all at once, like the wonder and ease of flight through the realms of a dream, over landscapes that had no more substance than the landscapes of a dream. She shivered. The inn was very cold, she thought. She fancied that she could see her breath, though she couldn't. She was dressed in brown corduroy pants, a white cotton blouse, and a brown bulky knit sweater. She'd fastened the blouse at the neck with a green porcelain brooch she'd had since childhood, and still she was cold. It was 7:30, and darkness had settled over 7th Lake hours earlier. She thought she should regret having to leave the inn before long, but she looked forward to leaving as much as if it amounted to an escape, as if there were something that was bent on holding her here against her will, and perhaps even without its own knowledge. Because it already had the rest of them, she thought. Arnaud, Jean Ward, Muriel Fox, the Glens, Frances Carden. It had them, and it was going to keep them. She smiled. These were fanciful, romantic notions, and she enjoyed playing with them. It was the heft of the axe that was comforting, the feel of it, the weight of it. "Mama," said Pete Jr. from the bed, "where you going with that?" "I ain't going nowhere, Pete. I'm going out, and it's none of your business, so you go back to sleep." He was propped up on his elbows as he watched her. She was warmly dressed, in clothes he had grown accustomed to seeing his father in. Several bulky dark sweaters, an old brown leather jacket, faded jeans. Her large body made the clothes look as if they were tight-fitting, and she had the axe in a kind of backward grip, as if she were going to use it to pound a peg into the ground from overhead. As he watched, she changed her grip and held the axe as if she were going to chop wood, which was her normal way of carrying it. Pete said, "You gonna chop wood, Mama?" "No," she answered at once. "I ain't gonna chop no wood. I'm gonna go out, and it's none of your business, so you go back to sleep." She did not look at him as she said this. She kept her gaze on the window over his bed. There was nothing visible through it but a few lights across 7th Lake. If the room were dark, she could have seen the black mound of Dog Island a mile off, but she was looking at nothing beyond herself. She was looking inward, remembering, obeying. Don't go out, Mama, Pete Jr. pleaded. Got to go out, she told him, and lowered her head as if to look at him. If I don't go out tonight, then there's creatures gonna be awful cold tonight. You want that, Pete Jr.? I don't want no one to be cold, Mama. Why you ask me that? Wasn't asking nothing. I was telling you. I'm going out. She raised her head. Pete lay down and pulled the blanket up to his neck. It's awful cold, Mama. This place is awful cold. Always been so, darling, she said. Always been so, long as I can remember, or anyone. It's the way of things. The lake is cold, and people want to live here. Well, they'll be cold too. Can I listen to the radio while you're gone, Mama? Can I watch the TV? In the house under the lake, the entity which had once been Benjamin Mosiman rose from the remains of its bed on the second floor, the same bed the entity that had once been Anita Mosiman had shared with him for many years, and made its way very slowly to the door and then down the hallway to the top of the stairs. It stopped there. I'm leaving soon, Mary said. She was sitting in a chair in front of her father's desk. Arnaud said, Where will you go? This is your home. There are people I can stay with, Dad. I'm uncomfortable here. I'm sorry. I want you to stay, daughter. Why? Because I love you. She could not be deceptive with him. She said, I love you too, Dad, but I have to leave. I have to. He gave a few moments to silence. Then he said, nodding, I know that, and I know why. This surprised her. She said, What do you know? Only that we are in trouble. We? Us. All of us here at the inn. He nodded to indicate his office. I stand alone here in the dark often. It encompasses me. I feel it as if it were real, as if there were stars in it and I could touch them. But they are cold, daughter. The darkness is cold and I'm touched by it. I think it is your mother touching me. Oh, Daddy! She was distressed, wanting to reach out to him, but she sensed that he was making himself unreachable. He said, I look at you and I wonder, can there be anybody so young? But there is, and it is you. He patted his shirt pocket. I want a cigarette. You don't smoke. I did once in the medieval past, before dinosaurs. Daddy, come with me. Come away from here. He shook his head. No, Martha is here. She is dead, but she exists here. I can't alter what is here. But you can join her, Daddy? Again he shook his head. I don't understand that. I have no need to join her. I have all I need of her here. He touched his temple. All I will ever need of her is here. I don't think you know what's happening, Daddy. I don't know. I don't think you know what's happening here at the inn, or what's happening to you. Arnaud's face reddened with anger. After several long moments, he said, You are telling me, daughter, that this is an evil place, and I do not credence such things. I have never. If this is an evil place, then there are things here which are evil, things I do not understand, and they killed her. Mary said, reaching across the desk to touch him, although the distance was too far. If you believe that, Daddy. I'm not stupid, he cut in. I may talk strange, but I'm not stupid. Mary withdrew her hand. I'm sorry, I thought we could talk, but we've never really been able to talk, have we? Not really. He said nothing. Mary stood. He turned away. There was more than petulance in him. There was something about him that she had never before encountered, something cold and unapproachable, as if he were a winter ghost. It made her suddenly fearful. We'll talk in the morning, she said, turned and left the room. She did not look back before closing the door behind her. and so she did not see that Arnaud had turned and was watching her, and that there was pleading in his eyes. Thank you for listening to this week's episode, and I hope you'll join us next week for another installment of The Island. And until then, have a great week, everyone.